Hello and welcome viewers. Today we will study The Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh from the main textbook of class 11, Hornbill. My name is Ratna Pathak, PGT English. Dear students, the targeted learning outcomes of today's lesson are: first one, to be able to appreciate Khushwant Singh's style of writing an autobiographical account. Second, to appreciate the descriptive narrative of the text and to be able to use phrases and expressions in write-ups of your own. To reflect upon your loved ones and appreciate the bond of affection you have with them. Dear viewers, before we study the lesson, let us know about the author Khushwant Singh. Khushwant Singh is bound to go down in Indian literary history as one of the premium historians, novelists, upfront political commentators, exceptional observers and social critics. He was born in 1915 in Hadali, now in Pakistan, and died on 20th March 2014. Khushwant Singh was a member of parliament from 1980 to 1986. He was awarded Padma Bhushan in 1974 and Padma Vibhushan in 2007. Talking about his work, Khushwant Singh was the founder editor of Yojana, the National Herald and the Hindustan Times. His most famous novel is Train to Pakistan, which was published in 1956. It is about his experience during the partition of India. Some of his other well-known books are The Marks of Vishnu and Other Stories, I Shall Not Hear the Nightingales, The Company of Women and many more. Dear viewers, the present story, The Portrait of a Lady, was published in 2007, though it seems to have been written much earlier. It is an autobiographical short story that belongs to the modern literary period. It has been set in a small village and a city in northern India before 1947. It is a first-person narration. This means that the author himself is the narrator. Since it is based on author's life, The Portrait of a Lady is an autobiographical piece. Autobiographical writing is a genre of literature in which the author writes about his or her life experiences, thoughts, feelings, etc. So we can say that it is purely personal experience. Dear viewers, let me tell you something more about autobiographical writing. It is a form of self-expression through storytelling where the author narrates events, reflects on personal growth and explores his identity. Famous examples of autobiographical writing include The Diary of a Young Girl by Anne Frank, The Autobiography of Malcolm X, and The Story of My Experiments with Truth by Mahatma Gandhi. Dear students, by now you are familiar that The Portrait of a Lady is a part of an autobiography of Khushwant Singh. In this story, the author draws a pen portrait of his grandmother. Do you know what a pen portrait is? A pen portrait is an informal description of a person or group of people. This may cover age and other hard variables, but will focus on softer dimensions such as attitudes, appearance and lifestyles. The author talks about his grandmother and beautifully unfolds their relationship and how it undergoes several changes. In other words, the story is a loving tribute from a grandson to his grandmother. The story gives a picture of human relationships. It is a realistic account of how grandparents give all their time, attention and love to their grandchildren. The story can be divided into three phases. Phase 1, the narrator and his grandmother in the village. Phase 2, when they move to live in the city with the parents of the narrator. Phase 3, grandson going to the university and then abroad for higher studies. We find the changing face of relationship between the grandson and his grandmother with the transition of time. Now coming to the characters, our story has two characters, the grandmother and her grandson. The grandmother was a very religious woman. She was very kind lady. She was short, fat and slightly bent. Her face was wrinkled and she was always dressed in spotless white clothes. In the village, she took care of all the needs of the author when he was a child. She was unhappy when she could not help her grandson in his studies in the city, but she adjusted without complaining. I'm sure she reminds you of your own grandmother. Now coming to grandson, the grandson Khushwant Singh, the narrator of the story, The Portrait of the Lady, was a sensitive and observant person. He cherished the memories of his association with his grandmother. He has beautifully described the details about many episodes from his past life where he was related to his grandmother. Like all of us, he too had a very fond memories of his grandmother. Dear students, to comprehend a story well, we must be aware of the themes it is based on. The major themes in the story are generation gap. The grandmother is not happy with the modern education of her grandson. She has her age-old religious beliefs and does not approve of the scientific and non-religious syllabus. But the beauty is that she does not hinder her grandson's education. And the next theme is familial bonds. The story depicts the lovely bond between the grandparents and their grandchildren. There is also a hint of relationship between the grandmother and her daughter-in-law, Khushwant Singh's mother. She respects her mother-in-law and tries to carry out her tradition of feeding the birds. Another theme is spiritualism. The grandmother has been portrayed as a very religious person. Her religious beliefs give her the strength to live alone in the village with a small child. The next theme, celebrating childhood or nostalgia. The affectionate and fond description of his grandparents remind us how happy and content Khushwant Singh's childhood was. The next theme, changing phases of relationships. Everything changes with time. So do relationships. This story shows that changing phases of relationships do not compromise the love people have for each other. Love for nature or animals is one of the themes. Grandmother can be seen feeding dogs and birds. This shows the rich cultural tradition of India where every living organism is valued. Adaptation in lifestyles with changing times. Migrating from villages to city brought many changes in the lives of grandmother and Khushwant Singh, but they both accepted the change and adapted to their new life comfortably. Let us now begin with the text, The Portrait of a Lady by Khushwant Singh. Let us start reading the lesson. We take up the first paragraph of the chapter. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for 20 years I had known her. People said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. Dear students, do you notice some lines underlined here? These lines make an interesting read. One such portion is, people said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband. Khushwant Singh says, it was difficult to believe that old and wrinkled grandmother was once young and pretty and married to a young man. This is because he had always known his grandmother as an old woman. When you have known somebody as old always, it is hard to visualize them as young. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. He wore a big turban and loose-fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. He did not look like the sort of person who would have a wife or children. He looked as if he could have lots and lots of grandchildren. Please notice how Khushwant Singh describes his grandfather, who was no longer alive. He describes his portrait and with a sense of humor says that such an old man can only have grandchildren. Imagining this old man with a young wife and little children was difficult for him. Now coming to the key points of this paragraph. So far we have discussed that the author talks about his grandmother's appearance and the perception of age. He describes her physical features. She is an old woman with a wrinkled face. He was 20 years old when at the time of this description. It was difficult for him to believe that his grandmother was young and pretty. Like any other child, he does not consider his grandmother to be an ordinary human being who had grown up seeing all the phases of life, childhood, youth, adulthood and old age. For children, adults had always been adults. He considers his grandmother's childhood stories as a fairy tale or fables. There is a sense of disbelief in the narrator regarding the youth of his grandparents. The paragraph establishes the perception of the grandmother's age, setting the stage for further exploration of this relationship with the lady. He mentions his grandfather in relation to his grandmother. He hadn't seen him. His portrait hung in the hall. He looked very old with a long white beard and turban. It seemed that he had always been old, never young enough to be a father. This image shown here is likely how the author's grandfather appeared, based on the description in the paragraph. The turban signifies a cultural or traditional background, and a beard can be associated with wisdom, maturity, or a sense of authority. The image conveys a sense of age and dignity, reflecting on the perception that the grandfather is an elderly figure. You must have seen a mantelpiece in old houses. A mantelpiece is a structure typically made of wood, marble or stone situated around a fireplace. It serves as a shelf above the fireplace. The mantelpiece is often adorned with various objects such as photographs, vases, clocks, or in this case a portrait. It provides a space to showcase cherished items or family memorabilia. The grandfather's portrait on the mantelpiece suggests that it holds an important place within the family's history and is an important figure in the household. These two pictures help paint a visual representation of the author's family and heritage. The image of the turban grandfather reflects a sense of cultural identity and tradition. At the same time, the mantelpiece with the portrait highlights the importance of family connections and the passing down of memories and legacies down the generations. Dear viewers, let us now stop and try to analyze whatever we have read so far in paragraph 1. Try to answer these questions in your mind. How has the writer described the grandfather? Why does the writer refer to a portrait of his grandfather? Does it have any significance with the title of the lesson? Why do you think Khushwant Singh makes an instant connection with his readers in his opening line? I shall take up the second question. Why does the writer refer to a portrait of his grandfather? Does it have any significance with the title of the lesson? Students, you must have noticed that there is a portrait of the grandfather on the room as he is no longer alive. Also, interestingly, the writer starts his autobiographical account with a description of an actual portrait, that is, of his deceased grandfather. Then he starts writing a pen portrait of his grandmother, who is alive and with whom he shares a special bond. Moving to the third question, why do you think Khushwant Singh makes an instant connect with his readers with his opening line? Let us now see how Khushwant Singh starts his writing. My grandmother was a very old woman like everybody's grandmother. It is a general statement. In the same line, when the writer talks about his grandmother and all other grandmothers, he instantly connects with his readers. All readers start reflecting on their grandmothers and feel a definite connect with the story. Let us move to the second paragraph. She had always been short, fat and slightly bent. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. No, we were certain she had always been as we had known her. Old, and so old that she could not have grown older and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. Khushwant Singh begins his paragraph with the physical description of his grandmother, particularly her wrinkled face. As he had always seen her old, he could not find any difference in her face in the past 20 years. He describes her as beautiful. Let's continue. She hobbled about the house in spotless white and one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop and the other telling her beads of a rosary. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale puckered face and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. Yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. Khushwant Singh continues the description, now focusing on her physique. His grandmother walked with a stoop. This means she could not stand straight due to her old age. This extract also brings out the religious nature of grandmother. Some expressions to reflect on. Dear viewers, mark this expression. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. The crisscross of wrinkles denotes the wrinkled face of the old grandmother. For a child, these wrinkles are always fascinating to behold. Khushwant Singh seems to have been equally fascinated, and when he says crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere, he seems to have traced these wrinkled lines and found them everywhere on his grandmother's face. Let us take another expression from the paragraph. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. Notice how Khushwant Singh differentiates between the words pretty and beautiful. Pretty means attractive, pleasing to the eye and charming. Beautiful, however, may not be simply an external appearance. It refers to the inner grace and loveliness of a person. A 6-year-old bubbly girl can be called pretty, but when you talk of a 60-year-old woman, you cannot use the word pretty for her. Therefore, Khushwant Singh calls his grandmother beautiful and not pretty. Another expression, coming to winter landscape in the mountains. See how and why the grandmother is compared to snow-covered mountains. And most importantly, the old mountains draped in the snow seemed serene and peaceful. The grandmother, clad in a white dress, praying to God, looked just as peaceful and serene. Now coming to the key points of the second paragraph. Since his childhood, Khushwant Singh had seen his grandmother old. He found his grandmother beautiful. He differentiates between beautiful and pretty. The former is an inner quality, while the latter is a physical quality. The religious behavior of his grandmother gave her a serene and peaceful personality. By comparing his grandmother to the winter landscape in the mountains, the author elaborates her peaceful looks. This comparison also tells about the place where he grew, that is, West Punjab. Let us now analyze the second paragraph. Think about these questions. What words describe the aging grandmother? Then, do we get to know anything about the grandmother besides the fact that she was an old woman? And what figure of speech is used in the last sentence? Let us discuss the second question. Do we know anything about the grandmother besides the fact that she is an old woman? The way the writer describes the grandmother, who held rosary beads in her hand and prayed inaudibly, helps to establish that the grandmother was a religious lady. The color white highlights the peaceful and spiritual countenance of the lady. The third question, what figure of speech is used in the last sentence? You all know that it is simile used here, where the grandmother is compared to wintry snow-covered mountains. We have finished the first two paragraphs of the lesson. Let us now reflect upon our learning today. Ponder over these questions. They will help you recapitulate the text read. Question number 1. What do we learn about Khushwant Singh's grandfather from the lesson? We learn that Khushwant Singh's grandfather was no more. His portrait was kept at the mantelpiece. He looked very old in his portrait. Question 2. Why did Khushwant Singh not believe in his grandmother's stories? To answer this, we can say that when grandchildren are born, the person is already old. The grandchildren never see their grandparents as young people. So, it is difficult for them to visualize them as young and fun-loving people. Question 3. How did Khushwant Singh describe his grandmother? Khushwant Singh has given a very accurate pen portrait of his grandmother. We can visualize his grandmother as a very old lady with a wrinkled face walking with a stoop. And finally, question 4. Why did Khushwant Singh compare his grandmother to a winter's landscape in the mountains? The reference of winter landscape tells us that Khushwant Singh grew up in Himachal Pradesh, where the hills are covered with snow in winter season. Also, the white robe and white hair of his grandmother make this description apt. With this, we conclude today's session. This is your assignment for the day. First, use the following expressions in the sentence. A. The thought was almost revolting. B. Crisscross of wrinkles. C. Silver locks. Question 2. List all descriptive words or phrases or expressions used for the grandmother. Question 3. Why did Khushwant Singh treat his grandmother's stories as fables of the prophet? Question 4. Write a pen portrait of your grandmother. Question 5. Write a diary entry describing a day spent with your grandmother.